The Second World War was a battle of machines, as much as it was a clash of nations, ideologies, and human will. Factories worked around the clock, producing aircraft that would define the skies. Spitfires over Britain, Messerschmitts over Europe, Zeros over the Pacific, and B-17s in the thunderous raids over Germany. These planes became icons of their nation's struggle, legends of engineering immortalized in film, photographs, and the collective memory of a generation. But history is also filled with shadows, what-ifs, almosts, and forgotten designs that never saw their true potential. Among them lies one of the most haunting questions in aviation history, the story of the plane that could have won the war, but didn't. It was faster, deadlier, and in many ways ahead of its time. Engineers envisioned it as a machine that could tilt the balance of power, a weapon so advanced that, had it arrived in numbers and on time, the entire trajectory of the conflict might have been altered. And yet, in the chaotic theater of war, where politics, resources, rivalries, and human ego collided, this aircraft became not the savior of a nation, but a ghost. Forever remembered in whispers, in old photographs, in fragments of prototypes. Buried in archives and museums, this is the tale of that plane. A story not just of wings and engines, but of ambition and failure. Of men who dreamed of rewriting history and of the stubborn tide that swept those dreams away. Tonight, we'll go deep into the world of engineers and generals, of secret airfields, and test flights, of the devastating potential that never reached the battlefield. This is the story of the plane that could have won World War II, but didn't. It began not in the skies where legends are forged, but in the minds of engineers hunched over drafting tables, their pencils scratching across blueprints that looked more like visions of the future than weapons of the present. The early 1940s were an age of desperation, when every great power in the war sought something, anything, that could give them the edge. The Allies needed a machine that could withstand the fury of German innovation. The Axis, a miracle that could slow the relentless advance of Allied production. Within this crucible of urgency emerged an aircraft so radical, so advanced in its conception, that it seemed like science fiction compared to the propeller-driven machines then dominating the skies. It was not just another fighter or bomber, it was meant to be a paradigm shift. Jet propulsion was no longer an experiment whispered about in laboratories. It was an imminent reality. Whoever mastered it first would control the future of aerial warfare. And so this plane, sleek, futuristic, terrifying in its promise, was envisioned to break the chains of convention. Test pilots whispered that the very first prototypes felt like stepping into another century. Where once they had to brace against the raw vibrations of piston engines, here was a machine that surged forward with a smooth, unrelenting thrust. Its lines were aerodynamic perfection, every curve calculated for speed, every rivet placed with obsessive intent. Generals saw in it the possibility of domination, a weapon that could sweep enemy bombers from the sky, outrun interceptors, and strike at the heart of enemy strongholds before defenses could even react. If mass-produced, it could have redefined the war. The calculus of attrition, the grinding stalemate of industrial might, could have been disrupted by a single technological leap. Yet for all its promise, this machine was shackled by the chaos of the very war it was meant to change. The irony was profound. The same desperation that birthed it also crippled it. Factories were already stretched thin. Engineers pulled in a dozen directions, and bureaucrats with competing agendas strangled progress. Some saw it as a wonder weapon, others dismissed it as a distraction, a drain of precious resources that should be spent on proven aircraft already rolling off assembly lines. Politics, as much as engineering, dictated its fate. The leaders who championed it were at odds with those who clung to the present, and in that tug of war, time slipped away. The plane existed in a liminal state, too advanced to ignore, yet too radical to fully embrace. What made it truly haunting, however, was not simply its potential, but the tantalizing glimpses it provided. On rare occasions, when the prototypes were unleashed into the sky, the results were undeniable. Enemy pilots who encountered it in brief, scattered engagements returned shaken, describing an opponent that seemed untouchable. Gun cameras captured blurs that moved faster than their eyes could follow, aircraft vanishing into the horizon before tracers even touched their tails. The machine could dive without tearing itself apart, climb without hesitation, and leave entire squadrons bewildered. It was not just a step forward, it was a leap, and yet each appearance was fleeting, a phantom haunting the war rather than commanding it. The tragedy of the plane that could have won World War II is that it revealed the fragility of technological miracles. A machine, no matter how brilliant, is nothing without the infrastructure to sustain it. Without trained pilots, reliable fuel, factories free from bombardment, and leaders capable of seeing its importance beyond political rivalries. Its engines, though revolutionary, were temperamental and fragile. Spare parts were scarce, mechanics untrained, and supply lines disrupted. More than once, a marvel of speed was grounded simply because a critical component could not be replaced. The weapon that might have turned the tide was reduced to a handful of flights, its legend built not on victory, but on unrealized potential. And so, as the war thundered on, this aircraft became less a weapon of conquest and more a symbol of frustration. To those who flew it, there was awe mixed with heartbreak. They knew what it could do, what it represented, but also what it could never become. To commanders, it was both a promise and a reminder of their limitations, a shining example of what was possible, buried under the rubble of reality. In the end, it was not enemy fire that killed this dream, but time, circumstance, and the unrelenting tide of history. The story of this aircraft cannot be told without first understanding the world into which it was born. A world where the sky itself was a battlefield, contested day and night, where thousands of planes were built not as individual marvels of craftsmanship, but as expendable tools of attrition. By 1943, the air war was a brutal calculus of numbers, thousands of B-17s and B-24s rising from English airfields in massive formations, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs cutting through the flak-filled skies above Germany. Against them rose the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, defenders of a crumbling Reich, pilots strapped into machines that were increasingly outdated against the relentless tide of Allied production. The war was no longer about brilliance alone. It was about who could replace losses faster, who could flood the skies with machines faster than the enemy could shoot them down. Yet, into this storm stepped a plane that seemed to defy the arithmetic of war. It was not about quantity, it was about quality so overwhelming that quantity might cease to matter. For those who first saw it in flight, the shock was visceral. Where Allied bombers droned along at 200 miles per hour and their escorts darted at 400, this machine could surge ahead with speeds approaching the unimaginable. Pilots who climbed into the cockpit spoke of acceleration that pressed them into their seats like no piston engine ever could, of a view from the canopy that transformed the world below into a blur. It was a weapon designed not just to fight but to dominate, to outrun the fastest, outclimb the strongest, and tear through formations before enemy eyes could even comprehend what was happening. In an era when every advantage mattered, here was an advantage so profound that it felt like the future had landed decades ahead of schedule. But wars are not won in test flights or prototypes. The vision of generals and engineers was one thing. The machinery of mass production, logistics, and strategy was another. Factories were already running at the limits of human endurance, resources strained, and rival designs competed for attention. Every plane approved meant another cancelled. Every rivet used here meant a rivet not used there. And in that unforgiving arithmetic, this wonder of engineering became a victim. Leaders argued whether it should be prioritized, whether it could be trusted, whether it was worth diverting steel, aluminum, and fuel from the war machines already in service. There were voices who called it the savior of the nation, and just as many who dismissed it as folly, a dangerous distraction. The war was slipping away, and some believed that chasing dreams was no substitute for grinding reality. Yet history is cruel in its ironies, for while factories hesitated and leaders bickered, the Allies pressed forward with their own innovations. The P-51 Mustang, with its long-range capabilities, began cutting through German air defenses, ensuring that bombers could strike at will. The Soviet Union, with its endless manpower, pushed back on the Eastern Front. The Allies were gaining strength every day, their skies filling with swarms of planes that could overwhelm even the best of the defenders. And in those skies, the advanced jet, this miracle of engineering, remained scarce, a phantom appearing only in whispers, its presence unable to shift the balance. 100 of them might have changed the air war, 1,000 could have delayed defeat, but dozens were not enough. Even so, the encounters that did occur left a mark. There are stories from Allied pilots who returned shaken, their voices tight as they described seeing an enemy that moved as though the laws of flight had been rewritten. Gunfire that normally found its mark now trailed harmlessly behind. Maneuvers that once guaranteed survival were rendered meaningless. It was not that the jet was invincible. Pilots discovered that when it slowed, when it turned, when it was forced into battle rather than flight, it could be vulnerable. But in its element, at full throttle, slicing through the sky, it was untouchable. And that reality haunted those who faced it. What if there had been more? What if the war had lasted just a little longer, or the priorities of leaders shifted? Just a little sooner, history might have remembered the skies of 1944 and 1945 very differently. Yet for all its promise, the aircraft was never free from its chains. The engines, brilliant but fragile, often failed after only a few dozen hours of flight. Mechanics struggled to maintain them in the chaos of bombed-out airfields. Replacement parts arrived too late, if at all. The very fuel it required was scarce, drained by a collapsing economy and a nation on its knees. Pilots, too, were in short supply. The veterans of earlier years were gone, replaced by boys barely trained to handle the simplest of aircraft, now asked to tame a beast decades ahead of its time. Technology alone could not win a war. It needed a system, a nation, an infrastructure. And by the time this miracle took to the skies, the system that might have sustained it was already crumbling. The haunting truth is this. The plane that could have won World War II was ready, but the world around it was not. It was like a sword, forged too late for a battle already lost, brilliant in craftsmanship, but useless without an army to wield it. Its story is not merely one of engineering triumph, but of the fatal intersection of timing, politics, and human limitation. It reminds us that history is not just shaped by what is possible, but by what is practical, by what is chosen, and by what is sacrificed in the name of survival. And in the smoke-filled skies of the 1940s, practicality and overwhelming numbers triumphed over brilliance. To understand why this aircraft, this miracle that seemed born from the future, failed to alter the outcome of the war, we must step inside the world of those who tried to bring it to life. Picture the engineers in underground workshops, huddled against the distant thunder of bombs dropping overhead, their eyes fixed on blueprints illuminated by flickering lamps. They knew they were working on something extraordinary. They spoke in hushed tones about thrust, lift, and aerodynamics in ways that sounded more like prophecy than engineering. They were visionaries trapped in a collapsing empire, trying to build tomorrow's machine with yesterday's resources. The materials they needed were scarce, the alloys too brittle, the fuels too impure. Every finished part bore the scars of improvisation, of corners cut not because they wished it, but because they had no choice. It was as if they were carving a masterpiece from stone that crumbled in their hands. Yet for all their struggles, the dream came alive in brief flashes of brilliance. Test flights captured the imagination of those few allowed to witness them. When the engines roared to life, their sound was unlike anything else in the skies, less a mechanical chug, more a howl, an otherworldly scream that made even hardened soldiers stop and stare. For the pilots who first strapped themselves in, there was both exhilaration and fear. They spoke of the machine's speed as intoxicating, of climbing into altitudes where piston fighters simply could not follow, of diving past enemy bombers so quickly that gunners were left spinning in confusion. The jet was not just faster, it was smoother, almost alive, its streamlined body cutting through the air as if it belonged there, and for a fleeting moment, those who saw it believed salvation might truly be at hand, but the jet carried within it the seeds of its own tragedy. The engines, though revolutionary, were fragile, sometimes lasting only 25 hours before needing replacement. Mechanics worked frantically on the tarmac, struggling to diagnose problems with technology that had no precedent. There were no manuals, no decades of accumulated wisdom, only guesswork, experimentation and desperation. Fuel was a constant problem too. The refined fuel it required was scarce, often substituted with lower quality mixtures that reduced performance or caused catastrophic failures. On more than one occasion, pilots perished not at the hands of the enemy, but because the very heart of their machine betrayed them mid-flight. For all its futuristic brilliance, it was still tethered to the imperfect present. The other great obstacle was time. By the time the jet reached operational status, the enemy had already achieved near total dominance in the air. Allied bombers swept across the skies daily, their escorts ensuring that few defenders even reached them. The factories where the jets were built were under constant bombardment, slowing production and scattering resources. Trains carrying parts were destroyed, supply lines severed, prototypes lost in the chaos before they could even take to the skies. And as the Allies advanced on the ground, the very runways from which these aircraft might have flown were seized or rendered unusable. Each successful test, each brief combat sortie was followed by the crushing realization that there would never be enough of them to matter. Still, the men who flew them tried. They took to the skies in small numbers, hurling themselves at vast formations of bombers, trying to stem the tide with machines that should have ruled the heavens. For brief moments, they succeeded. Gun camera footage from Allied bombers shows flashes of jets darting past, cannons blazing, entire bombers falling from the sky before their gunners even had a chance to aim. Panic spread among Allied crews. Reports filtered back of an enemy machine that could not be caught, could not be matched. Commanders whispered nervously about what might happen if hundreds of these machines appeared at once. But the nightmare never came. For every jet that roared into the sky, a dozen were grounded, waiting for parts, repairs, or fuel that never arrived. And then there was the human factor. The machine demanded the best of pilots, men with skill, experience, and instincts honed over years of combat. But by 1944 and 1945, those men were gone. The veterans of the early war were either dead or exhausted, and in their place came boys, barely trained, shoved into cockpits with only a handful of flight hours. They were handed a machine far beyond their ability to master, and many never returned. Some died on their very first mission, not because the enemy outflew them, but because they themselves could not control the beast they had been given. The tragedy was not only in the wasted machines, but in the wasted lives of the young men asked to wield them. Thus, the jet became less a weapon of salvation and more a symbol of futility. Each time it rose into the sky, it demonstrated what might have been. Each time it fell short, it reminded the world of the futility of brilliance when unsupported by preparation. For the Allies, it was a curiosity, a danger, but never a decisive threat. For the Axis, it was a cruel promise, a glimpse, a victory that would never come, a reminder that even the brightest flame cannot stop the night if it burns too late. By the closing months of the war, the aircraft had become less of a secret weapon and more of a legend whispered among soldiers and civilians alike, a ghost that appeared in the skies too rarely to change the course of battles, yet often enough to stir imaginations. In the rubble-strewn cities, where citizens huddled in basements as bombs rained above, rumors circulated of a machine that could strike fear into Allied pilots, that could drive back the endless waves of bombers reducing their homes to dust. Newspapers spoke cautiously of new technology that would change everything. Propaganda films hinted at salvation just over the horizon. And for a desperate people clinging to hope amid devastation, the jet became a symbol of possibility. It did not matter that production lagged behind promises or that fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Belief was powerful, and belief in miracles stronger still. But wars are not won by belief alone, and in the skies above Europe, the relentless advance of Allied air power proved immune to whispered legends. The few units that did receive operational jets fought with determination, but they were swimming against a tidal wave. Allied intelligence quickly recognized the threat and adjusted tactics. Bomber formations were instructed to keep tighter groups, their escorts to fly higher and farther. Ahead, scouring the skies for the faint glimmer of a jet's exhaust trail. The Allies knew the machine was faster, but they also knew it was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and so they developed strategies to strike at its airfields. Entire squadrons of Mustangs and Thunderbolts would patrol near suspected bases, waiting to pounce as jets returned low on fuel, their speed advantage useless as they slowed to touch the runway. Time and again, the miracle machine was destroyed not in the heat of combat, but at its most fragile moments, its wreckage burning on the very ground from which it had promised salvation. And yet, when it did manage to take flight unhindered, its impact was undeniable. There are stories of entire bomber groups thrown into chaos as a handful of jets descended upon them, their cannons ripping apart aircraft in seconds. Survivors recalled the terrifying sound of jet engines rushing past, unlike anything they had ever heard, and the helplessness of watching comrades fall without ever seeing what hit them. Some veterans would later admit that these encounters shook their confidence more than any other weapon of the war. For a moment, the vast superiority of Allied numbers seemed meaningless when faced with speed and firepower that belonged to another generation. The fear was real, but fear without numbers cannot win wars. A dozen miracles cannot match 1,000 machines, and so the story repeated. Brief terror, fleeting victories, and then the crushing weight of overwhelming Allied dominance pressing forward unchanged. Within the Axis leadership, debates raged endlessly over how the jet should be used. Some argued it should be a pure interceptor, focused entirely on tearing apart Allied bombers. Others insisted it could be a fighter bomber, striking at ground targets, forcing enemies to split their defenses. This disagreement wasted precious time, as resources were funneled into modifying the design, delaying its mass deployment even further. In the end, the plane became a victim of indecision, forced to fulfill roles for which it was not intended, spreading its limited potential even thinner. Had it been unleashed with singular focus, perhaps the air war might have grown more dangerous, but instead it remained diluted, neither fully a guardian of the skies nor a scourge of the ground. For the pilots who flew it, the emotional weight was immense. They strapped themselves into cockpits knowing they were flying marvels, and yet also knowing they were outnumbered, outsupplied, and in many cases doomed before their wheels even left the ground. Some spoke afterward of the heartbreak of piloting a machine that should have ruled the air, only to watch comrades fall around them, overwhelmed by sheer Allied numbers. The jet was not just a weapon. It was a constant reminder of what could have been. In their hands lay the finest technology their nation had ever produced, and yet they were asked to wield it at the end of a war already lost. It was both an honor and a curse to hold in their hands the key to victory, but too late to unlock the door. And so, the aircraft story became inseparable from the collapse of the nation that built it. As armies closed in on all sides, as cities burned and leaders grew desperate, the jet flew its final missions amid chaos. Some were abandoned on runways, half-fueled, their engines stripped for parts. Others were destroyed by retreating forces to prevent capture. A few fell intact into Allied hands, trophies of a war nearly won, their sleek forms studied with awe by those who recognized how far ahead of its time the design truly was. In the end, the miracle plane did not decide the war. Instead, it became a relic of a future that arrived too late, a monument to wasted potential, and a haunting reminder that even the most brilliant creation cannot escape the weight of circumstance. When the war finally ended and silence returned to skies once filled with fire and steel, the plane that could have won World War II stood not as a victor, but as a paradox. Captured examples were shipped to Allied nations, dismantled piece by piece in hangars filled with curious engineers who marveled at what they found. The Allies, who had fought against it in fear, now studied it with respect. They ran their hands along its sleek frame, peered into its engines, and realized just how close the world had come to a new era of air combat. The machine, flawed and fragile though it was, contained within it the seeds of the jet age, the blueprint for the future of aviation. For those who examined it, there was both relief and unease. Relief that it had arrived too late to matter, unease at the recognition that wars yet to come would not be fought with propellers and pistons, but with machines born of this design. The United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain all poured resources into dissecting the captured jets. American test pilots flew them over desert airfields, reporting on their speed, their quirks, their remarkable climb and dive capabilities. British engineers examined the engines, astonished at the innovations squeezed from a nation under siege. The Soviets, ruthless in their pursuit of technology, hauled away whole aircraft and rebuilt them in their own factories, laying the foundation for a new generation of fighters. In this way, the plane that failed to save its creators ended up shaping the victor's arsenals. Its legacy was paradoxical, a weapon too late to matter in its own war, but pivotal in shaping the wars that followed. It became the cornerstone of a new reality where speed and jet propulsion would dominate the skies forevermore. But for those who had built it, who had flown it, who had placed their faith in it as a miracle, there was no satisfaction in its post-war legacy. For them, it was a story of heartbreak, of wasted potential, of brilliance that could not overcome circumstance. Engineers who survived the war later reflected with bitterness on how bureaucracy and political indecision had crippled their creation. They recalled how production was delayed by leaders insisting it be modified for roles it was never designed, for how resources were squandered on obsolete projects while their masterpiece gathered dust. Some spoke with quiet pride of what they had achieved under impossible conditions, but most could not escape the sense that history had betrayed them, that they had handed their nation the key to survival, only for that key to be discarded. Until it was too late. For the pilots, the memories were more personal and more painful. Many who flew the jets survived the war only to live with the haunting knowledge that they had fought with one of the most advanced weapons ever created. And still, it had not been enough. They remembered the exhilaration of soaring faster than any enemy, the shock on bomber crews' faces as they struck from nowhere, the fleeting moments when they believed victory might still be possible. But they also remembered the frustration of running out of fuel after only a short sortie, of engines that died mid-flight, of comrades who never returned because the machine demanded more than they could give. Their stories became tales of both. Pride and sorrow. Pride in having flown the future, sorrow in knowing the future had arrived too late. In the years that followed, the jet's legend only grew. Aviation enthusiasts, historians and veterans debated endlessly about what if. What if it had been produced earlier, in greater numbers? What if the leadership had embraced its role as a pure interceptor? What if the resources poured into other doomed projects had instead fueled its mass production? Could it have stopped the bombing campaigns, prolonged the war, perhaps even altered the final outcome? The truth is unknowable, but the speculation endures, fueled by the haunting knowledge that the machine was real, that its potential was real, and that history balanced on decisions made in smoky conference rooms rather than on the wings of destiny. And so the jet became something more than just a plane. It became a symbol, a reminder of how fragile the line between victory and defeat can be, of how even the most brilliant creation can falter when weighed down by flawed systems, human error, and the chaos of war. For the victors, it was a prize, a glimpse into the future they would soon claim as their own. For the defeated, it was a ghost. A dream that dissolved into ash, a constant reminder of what might have been. And for the world at large, it was a turning point, the end of one era of flight and the dawn of another. As the Cold War dawned, the shadow of the jet loomed larger than ever. Its sleek lines and revolutionary engines echoed in every new design that roared from American, Soviet and British airfields. In many ways, the jet was the ancestor of an entire era, the spark that ignited a race for dominance in the skies, one that would span decades and circle the globe. The Korean War would soon see jet fighters dueling in earnest, their thunderous dogfights tracing lines across the heavens in ways that the world had only glimpsed during the dying days of World War II. And at the heart of those machines, every swept wing, every turbine, every burst of afterburner was the ghost of the plane that could have won the last war but didn't. But its influence was more than technical. It changed how nations thought about war itself. No longer could victory be assured by sheer numbers alone. Quality, true, radical, game-changing quality, was now recognized as just as important. The lessons of the jet haunted military planners on all sides. They saw what brilliance could achieve when too late, and they vowed never to let timing cripple them again. Thus began an arms race where speed of innovation mattered as much as the weapons themselves. Scientists and engineers were given new importance. Entire industries mobilized to chase the next breakthrough before an enemy could seize it first. The jet had failed to save its own nation, but in doing so, it taught the victors how to win the wars to come. Still, even as its influence rippled outward, the legend of the jet remained shrouded in tragedy. To those who had lived through its brief flashes in combat, it was not merely an artifact of progress. It was a specter of what could have been. Allied veterans spoke in interviews decades later of the chill they felt the first time they faced one, of how it seemed as though they were staring into the future while trapped in the present. They confessed relief that it had appeared too late, and gratitude that the skies had not filled with them in time to change the tide. German veterans, meanwhile, recounted the ache of watching their nation's greatest chance squandered, of being handed brilliance and then watching it burn away amid shortages, politics, and desperation. In these voices, the jet became more than metal. It became memory, regret, and the cruel poetry of history. The paradox deepened in popular culture. Books, documentaries, and films all return to the story of the plane that could have won. Enthusiasts built models of it. Museums placed it under spotlights, and its silhouette became instantly recognizable to generations who had never known war. It was celebrated not for what it achieved, but for what it almost achieved. In this way, it became a myth, half truth, half possibility, a symbol of how history is shaped not just by victories, but by near victories that slipped away. The myth grew stronger as time passed, its legend swelling larger than the actual number of machines ever built, as though imagination itself was determined to give it the presence it had been denied in reality. Yet beneath the fascination lay a darker truth, one that cannot be ignored. The jet was a product of desperation, built by a regime collapsing under its own weight, fueled by the labor of workers pressed into service under terrible conditions. Its brilliance was undeniable, but so too was the suffering behind its creation. To glorify it without acknowledging that human cost would be to tell only half the story. For every pilot who soared, there were hundreds of laborers who bent over, in exhaustion, who riveted wings by candlelight, who paid with their lives as bombs fell on the factories where they toiled. The machine's beauty and innovation cannot erase the shadows that linger in its origins. Its story is not only about what might have been, but also about what was sacrificed to build it. And so, as decades rolled forward and new generations of jets screamed across the skies, the original remained in museums and books, frozen in time. Children would press their faces against glass to stare at its sharp nose, its swept wings, its menacing stance, while guides told them how it had been the future before the future was ready. Engineers, historians, and dreamers would linger longer, contemplating the paradox, how something so advanced could fail so completely, how something so powerful could change everything yet decide nothing. The jet had become more than a weapon. It was now a riddle, a meditation on the limits of innovation when it collides with reality. The final irony of the jet's story lies not in its failure, but in its success after failure. For while it could not deliver its nation from defeat, it shaped the very world that emerged from the ashes of that defeat. Its designs were dissected by the victors, its engines copied, its aerodynamic principles studied with almost religious fervor. Within years, its DNA was evident in nearly every new aircraft that touched the skies. It was as though, in dying, it had scattered its essence across the globe, becoming immortal through imitation. Engineers in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union carried its spirit into projects that would define modern air power, from sleek interceptors to bombers capable of delivering destruction at unimaginable speed. The machine that lost the war won the peace, just not for the people who made it, and in that paradox rests a larger truth about history itself. Triumph and tragedy are not always measured in immediate outcomes. Sometimes failure plants the seeds of future revolutions, and defeat becomes the soil in which tomorrow's victories grow. The jet was a symbol of lost potential, but it was also proof of what humanity could achieve when it pushed the boundaries of imagination. Though its creators sought conquest, what they inadvertently gave the world was progress. Decades later, when astronauts rode rockets into orbit, their journey was powered in part by lessons learned from this single machine. The same wings that once clawed at the skies of Europe whispered forward into the silence of space. Yet, as time marched on, memory softened and myth grew stronger. Veterans faded away, but their testimonies lingered in archives. Engineers who had once pored over blueprints grew old, their hands trembling as they touched scale models of the aircraft that had defined their careers. Museums became shrines, visited by millions who gazed in awe at what once might have been. For them, it was not merely a relic, but a question, a what-if, frozen in steel and aluminum. What if it had arrived earlier? What if resources had not run dry? What if politics had not crippled production? The plane sat silent, refusing to answer, but in that silence it spoke louder than words. In the cultural imagination, it became something akin to a ghost ship, a vessel of destiny that never reached its harbor. Writers crafted alternate histories, where it dominated the skies, novels where its squadrons altered the course of battles, films where it screamed across silver screens as the ultimate weapon. In this way, the jet transcended its original purpose. It became less about the war it could have won and more about the lessons humanity learned from it. That timing, coordination, and foresight often matter more than sheer brilliance alone. The greatest technology means little if deployed too late or too poorly. History, after all, is merciless in its judgment of timing. Still, for all its symbolism, the jet's real power lies in the stories of those who encountered it. The Allied pilots who returned home after trembling dogfights against it told their grandchildren of the day they saw the future flying against them. German engineers, long since stripped of ideology, wrote memoirs, recalling their awe at what they had built, tempered by sorrow at how it was squandered. And for the countless unnamed workers, those who hammered, riveted, and bled in its construction, the jet was not legend, but memory, bound up with the hardships of their lives. Together, these voices weave a tapestry that no statistic or blueprint can capture. They remind us that the jet was not simply a machine, but a mirror of human ambition, ingenuity, and limitation. As the decades turned to centuries, its story did not vanish. It remains in textbooks, in documentaries, in the whispered awe of aviation enthusiasts who gather to marvel at its curves. To walk beneath its wings today is to feel a strange collision of pride and sorrow. Pride for what was achieved under impossible circumstances, sorrow for what was lost in the process, and for the haunting possibility that had it arrived sooner, the world might have been shaped in darker ways. It is a paradox etched into metal, the beauty of progress entangled with the horror of war. And perhaps that is why the jet's legend endures, not because it won, but because it didn't. Its failure allows us to admire it without fear, to marvel at it without living under the shadow of its full potential unleashed. In this way, the jet is both a warning and a wonder, preserved in the quiet halls of museums and in the restless imagination of history itself.